Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, I was thinking that we were getting into spring, and then just right on schedule, things got cold and rainy here in Seattle once again. We went for a walk yesterday. We got very wet, but it was still kind of nice to get out of the house. How are things going over there?
It's bright and sunny, but cold today. So, you know what they say, March comes in like a lion and out like a lamb? We're still in early March, so we're in lion phase right now.
And some of the people who are most feeling the cold and wet weather here in Seattle are going to be the topic of this week's episode. So Let's get right into it.
Yep.
So I asked you about the root of homelessness, and the context for this is that Seattle is at least partly famous for its homelessness problem. We apparently have the third highest per capita population of homeless people in the nation. And it's certainly a very visible part of living in Seattle. You can see tent encampments along the freeway in a number of locations. Homeless people are pretty much on every urban street. It's just part of life. And it raises the question, how did we get here? Like, what are the factors contributing to this? And all along, I've just heard this refrain, at least within the more progressive sources, of just build more housing, build more housing. And that seems like a simple solution. Affordable housing will get the homeless off the street, problem solved. But I'm the suspicious sort that tends to think that simple solutions are always a little bit incomplete and are not taking into account the full complexity of a problem. So I asked you, what is at the root of homelessness, and is it simply a matter of building more low-income housing? So what did you find?
Yeah, well, this is a depressing topic, and there's really no good answers. I mean, I'm going to try my best to lay out some root causes and some potential solutions. But I myself I'm not sure skeptical, cynical, I think is a better word for where I'm coming from about our ability to do what's necessary to take on homelessness in this country. But let's get into it. First, I just want to say, Mark, I'm sure you would agree that researching these questions for mansplaining gives us like endless opportunities to travel down informational rabbit holes.
Oh, yes, 100%.
But time doesn't permit us to report on what we found in every rabbit hole every time. And so it is with this question. I'm going to steer clear of the history of homelessness, even though it's interesting, because it's not as relevant to your questions about root causes and solutions as some other areas I researched.
Okay.
Let's start by defining homelessness. Most people think of homelessness as one thing, the person who lives and sleeps on the street. But that's imprecise. The U.S. government's Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, defines the literally homeless as, quote, an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, end quote, and whose primary nighttime residence, quote, is a public or private place not meant for human habitation, end quote. Homelessness is separated into four distinct categories: chronic, episodic, transitional, and hidden. HUD defines a chronically homeless person as one who's either been continuously homeless for at least a year or intermittently homeless at least 4 times in the last 3 years. This is the category that comes closest to our stereotype of homelessness. The chronically homeless are usually unaccompanied, older than the general population, and often suffering from a complicated long-term health issue. They live in one of those places not meant for human habitation, on the street, in a park, in a car. As of January 2019, there were about 87,000 chronically homeless people in the USA, but that's less than a sixth of the total population of homeless people. Episodic homelessness refers to those who've experienced 3 or more periods of homelessness in the past year. The episodically homeless are often younger and suffering from some kind of disabling condition like mental illness or substance abuse. Transitional homelessness is the most common category. These folks usually enter a shelter or other temporary housing once, briefly, usually because of a catastrophic event like a fire or a sudden life change like eviction or separation from an abusive partner. The fourth type, hidden homelessness, often goes unreported because its sufferers aren't on the streets or in shelters and don't seek homeless services per se. These are the people temporarily living with others, couch surfing among friends and family, without any place to stay long-term or any immediate prospects for permanent housing. Despite their need for homeless services and institutional support, they don't formally access it, so they don't appear in our standard statistics about homelessness. Since 2005, HUD has been measuring the overall number of homeless people in the USA and the makeup of that population via what's known as a point-in-time count. On a single night in late January every year, HUD requires its various state, local, and not-for-profit grant recipients to conduct an unduplicated count of all quote-unquote sheltered people in homeless shelters, emergency shelters, and transitional housing. One of the essential requirements of the point-in-time count is that the reporting entities ID things like the gender, ethnicity, and race of the counted person, whether they're an individual or an adult, whether they're part of a family group, or an unaccompanied youth under the age of 25, as well as whether the person is chronically homeless or has some disability adversely affecting their ability to find housing. The unsheltered population is officially counted by the feds every other year, though most local communities do it annually, using volunteers and outreach workers to sweep the streets and count everyone who appears to be living in places not meant for human habitation. For obvious reasons, the count of unsheltered homeless is not as precise, and the methodology of the count varies from place to place. The numbers for sheltered and unsheltered youth homelessness are underreported for several reasons. For example, some young people are afraid or unwilling to enter shelters, while others congregate in different, harder-to-find areas outside of like the traditional Skid Row where the older population is usually found.
Yeah.
But despite all those defects, the federal point-in-time count is the single most reliable data we have about homelessness in the United States. HUD uses the data from its single-night point-in-time counts to generate an annual Homeless Assessment Report, or AHAR, informing Congress of both the number of homeless people in the USA that year and the effectiveness of its remediation efforts. The report is used at the local level to help communities measure their own progress and adjust services and programs as necessary. HUD hasn't posted the AHAR for 2022 yet, but I reviewed the reports for the 2 years before that, and I want to give you and our listeners a statistical snapshot of homelessness in America.
Okay.
The reason I went back 2 years is because the 2021 report doesn't include data for the unsheltered population. Many agencies decided it wasn't safe to conduct field surveys of the unsheltered homeless in January 2021 before the wide availability of COVID vaccines. That's why I looked more carefully at the 2020 report, which had numbers for both the sheltered and unsheltered populations. On that single night in January 2020, just before COVID hit, 580,466 people experienced homelessness in the United States. To put that in perspective, that's just under 2 out of every 1,000 people in the United States. That top line number of 580,000 was lower than the nearly 650,000 people captured in the 2007 report. But it's been ticking up again since hitting a low of about 550,000 in 2016. Here's some descriptive and demographic data about those 580,000 homeless Americans. 61% were sheltered, 39% unsheltered. About 6 in 10 were individuals, while the rest were in families with children. 60.7% were male, 38.5% female, and 0.8% were either transgender or gender nonconforming, although that number is growing. 18.3% were under the age of 18, 7.8% were between 18 and 24, and 73.9% were over 24. About 6% were military veterans. California had the most homeless people, 28% of the national total, and had more than half of the unsheltered homeless. Compare that to New York, where 95% of the homeless were in shelters. 4 states, California, New York, Florida, and Texas, collectively had 53% of the nation's homeless population. And of course, racism has its role to play, as it does in nearly every bad news story about our country. African American households constitute only 13% of the national population, but account for 39.4% of the homeless population, while 25.8% were white and 22.5% Hispanic.
Yeah. Are states like California and Texas and Florida overrepresented because they're essentially magnet states for homeless people since they're warmer? And it's like particularly when we were living in Chicago, I always wondered how the homeless survived the winters there. So is there any evidence that warmer states just attract a population of people who are more likely to be spending the night outside?
You know, I didn't research that specifically, but the stat I just mentioned of California having more than half of the unsheltered homeless in the entire country, I think answers your question.
Yeah.
Because obviously in California, you can sleep on the beach. In New York or Illinois, you can't do that. So I think unquestionably the southern and western, southwestern states are probably magnets, particularly for unsheltered homeless.
Yeah, it does make some sense.
Now, the most recent AHAR report has some historical data in it for the period 2007 to 2021. It shows that the sheltered homeless population is falling, while the unsheltered population, largely composed of the chronically homeless, is growing. The number of sheltered homeless has been trending down steadily since 2007. Falling about 12% in the decade between 2010 and 2020, and by 8% alone between 2020 and 2021. That's the single largest one-year decline since records have been kept, and is probably related to the pandemic, when eviction moratoria were put in place to protect people from losing their homes, and when more homeless people may have chosen to forsake dormitory-style shelters and remain unsheltered for social distancing reasons.
Yeah.
By contrast, the chronically homeless population has been steadily rising since 2016 and saw a 20% spike between 2020 and 2021. No doubt also pandemic-related.
Yeah. And, as a harbinger of doom, I should point out the eviction moratoria are coming off the books. Seattle's was just canceled last week.
Yes.
So we will see, no doubt, a new spike of newly homeless people.
Absolutely true. When I defined the 4 categories of homelessness at the start, I mentioned in passing a few root causes of homelessness. I want to offer a more comprehensive list because it's responsive to your first question. So let's put aside housing for now. I'll get to that in a minute. There are a bunch of other root causes of homelessness, including family issues like breakups or domestic violence, financial problems, issues around prior housing like unsafe conditions, eviction, and soaring rents, addiction issues like substance abuse or gambling, physical or mental health issues. And let me just pause there to say that although the overall number of homeless people with mental illness and addiction disorders is quite low, among homeless single adults, the rates are scary. 1/3 of sheltered single adults and 2/3 of the unsheltered.
Well,
There's also a lack of viable options after transitioning out of government assistance like child and family services or leaving the criminal justice system. We've all heard those local news stories about prisoners who get out of jail and have no place to go and end up homeless.
right.
Moving from one city, town, or community to another is another frequent cause of homelessness. And finally, the death of a family member, like a spouse or parent, on whom one was relying for housing. I want to add one item to this list that isn't a root cause of homelessness per se, but certainly makes it harder to help the homeless, and that's NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. A city can't announce a plan to open a homeless shelter in a non-poor neighborhood without being besieged by community groups and politicians intensely lobbying against the plan, and then suing if they don't get the result they want. It's a sickening spectacle, but also utterly predictable.
Yes, Seattle is a proud home of NIMBY citizens who are compassionate for the homeless so long as they're not the locally homeless.
Yeah.
They should be homeless somewhere else.
Yeah, same here in New York, and I'm going to say more about that a little later. Notice, Mark, that I didn't mention one supposed root cause often cited by conservatives. It's their own fault. They're too lazy to work. This is a red herring, or perhaps I should say a red state herring. We have decades of research and survey data from homeless intake centers to prove that homelessness stems from adverse life events or medical conditions like the ones I just mentioned. For those who don't believe in facts, let me put it more bluntly. Homeless people are no more likely to be lazy than Trump voters are to be inbred morons. It just looks that way to the untrained eye.
Mm-hmm.
The housing affordability gap has widened dramatically over the last few decades. The dearth of affordable housing is a topic we already covered in episode number 34 of Mansplaining, The Rent is Too Damn High. But a few of those numbers are worth repeating here. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition published a study in which they found that for the country's lowest-income households, there was a shortage of nearly 7 million affordable rental homes. That gap of 7 million units is cited by many advocates as the crux of the homelessness problem in this country, as you alluded to in your question at the beginning. Factor in that 71% of low-income earners pay half or more of their income on rent every month, and you can understand why so many Americans are one medical emergency, one car repair, or one other adverse financial event away from eviction and homelessness.
Yeah, I can tell you in Seattle, if you're looking for let's say a 2-bedroom apartment, it's almost impossible to find anything below $2,000 a month. So you're looking at a bill of $25,000 a year just for housing. And if I'm not mistaken, the poverty line in this country is around 32,000. So that would mean that, I don't know, something like 95% of your income, if you're at the poverty line, is simply going towards housing. So, of course, you can't afford to live here, so you live a long ways away, which means that you have to spend money on a car or whatever to get into your work. And it's just, it creates this constant system of desperation.
Yes, and even if you're well above the poverty line, the number for distressed renters is if you're paying more than 1/3 of your income in rent. So you'd need to be making $75,000 a year or more in a place like Seattle in order to not be rent distressed. And, a lot of people don't make that kind of money.
Right. There's a measure in Seattle where new buildings that go up often need to reserve a certain number of units for lower income residents. But judging from what I'm seeing show up in the ad, they're still being expected to pay $1,600 to $1,700 a month in rent. And I cannot imagine that that is in any way affordable for people who are actually struggling with their income.
Agreed.
So even the units that are set aside for them as a way to address housing are still priced outside of what they could reasonably expect to pay.
Yeah. All right, now I want to pivot to solutions for homelessness, starting with the obvious. Beefing up the National Housing Trust Fund to build millions more affordable rental housing units is a key part of the solution. The private sector can't or won't do this, so the task falls to government. Building what's known as quote-unquote permanent supportive housing, which combines affordability with support services for people living with mental illness or other disabilities, would go a long way toward reducing the chronic homelessness of vulnerable populations while saving taxpayer dollars otherwise spent on shelter beds and costly hospitalizations. Congress and local governments can choose to maintain public housing and push back against the erosion of rent regulation laws pushed by rapacious developers who want to tear down or privatize our country's affordable housing stock. As to the question of whether affordable housing alone solves homelessness, the answer is definitely no. Poverty is the proximate cause of most people's inability to pay rent and then end up homeless. Poor health is another obvious factor, from chronic diseases like asthma and diabetes to acute problems like heart attacks and injuries to mental health issues. Health and poverty are often interrelated and create a double whammy for folks struggling to retain their jobs and housing. If you're in a low-wage job with little or no paid time off and you suffer an injury that requires hospitalization or lots of time to convalesce, you can lose your job and go deeply in debt, with the loss of your domicile not far behind. If you think about it that way, then any program or policy that addresses poverty or health is itself part of the solution to homelessness in America. Obamacare helps to end homelessness. Food stamps, a living wage job, paid child care, these are all part of the cure for homelessness.
But Joe, these are all features of communism and enemies of liberty.
Yes, quite. I am going to talk a little bit about people who feel that way near the end of this episode, so stay tuned. But the solutions I just mentioned about poverty and health, they do help cure homelessness, but the solutions to homelessness don't stop there. All levels of government have failed to dedicate adequate financial resources to existing housing programs. 3 out of 4 households eligible for assistance that might keep them stably housed, like Section 8 federal housing vouchers or targeted tax credits for renters, are turned away due to a chronic lack of funding. Some housing advocates have called for a national housing stabilization fund to help prevent evictions and homelessness by providing temporary financial assistance to households experiencing unexpected financial or medical shocks like the ones I just mentioned. Others call for increased enforcement of fair housing laws that are already on the books, as well as new legislation to protect the most vulnerable renters by banning housing discrimination based on things like sexual orientation, gender identity, or source of income. And by that I mean Section 8. There's so much discrimination against people who pay for housing using housing vouchers. Mm-hmm. And of course, a raft of federal and local eviction moratoria, as you mentioned, expired recently. And those moratoria kept millions of people from facing homelessness during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when so many jobs just disappeared seemingly overnight. One slightly out-of-the-box solution that's gaining traction in recent years is to move homeless people into inexpensive tiny homes. You may have heard about the tiny house movement, a social and architectural movement that advocates for the downsizing of living spaces as a simpler, less cluttered, and environment-friendly alternative to the residential housing industry. Have you heard of it, Mark? I'm just curious.
I have, and in fact, on the walk that Sonia and I took yesterday in the rainy weather, we saw a tiny home village near the University of Washington campus.
Tiny homes, by definition, do not exceed 400 square feet. Think of Henry David Thoreau's Massachusetts cabin where he wrote Walden. Tiny homes are sometimes built on wheels and are usually small enough to fit on a flatbed truck. Some look like glorified sheds, and others are quite aesthetically pleasing. In addition to tiny homes, there are also small homes from 400 to 1,000 square feet. And just in case you're wondering, because I was, the average size of single-family homes built today exceeds 2,600 square feet.
Yeah. Our apartment here in Seattle, Joe, is, wait for it, 425 square feet. So I'm experiencing this on a very personal level.
Yes. Small and tiny home sales currently represent just a fraction of the current real estate market, about 1%, but they've become increasingly popular in recent years, with numerous reality TV series and YouTube channels devoted to them. The modern tiny house movement started in the 1970s, but after the Great Recession of 2008-2009, when many people lost their homes and tent cities sprouted up in major cities all over the U.S., small and tiny homes were seen as an affordable option, and some housing advocates began thinking about them as transitional housing for homeless people. Communities of tiny houses were seen as potentially solving their residents' housing problems, while also affording them a space to connect with other people in similar circumstances. Several U.S. cities began building such communities, including your hometown of Seattle, the home to Othello Village, which opened in 2016. It sits behind a gas station and consists of 28 wooden homes and 12 tents housing 67 people. Residents share canvas tents that have shower, toilet, and kitchen facilities. The cabins initially lacked electricity and heat until local nonprofits stepped in to provide those amenities. The development is self-managed, with residents sharing chores like manning the security gate. Seattle was pleased enough with Othello that it scaled up a citywide effort to build 127 cabins, housing 310 residents in 5 locations around the city. You and your wife may have walked by one of those locations. And not surprisingly, the West Coast has become the proving ground for using tiny homes to fight homelessness, with large communities established in Eugene, Oregon, San Jose, California, and Olympia, Washington. Seattle and these other municipalities insist that tiny homes are just a stopgap solution on the way to permanent homes for those residents. What has hampered the further development of tiny homes is the same thing that hampers any affordable housing: strict zoning and building regulations at the local level. For example, you can't just place a tiny home on a plot of empty land because that plot might not be zoned for residential housing. And if the tiny house you build runs afoul of local building codes by not having all the necessary amenities required for a human dwelling, it's considered an accessory structure and needs to be sited on the same lot as a proper home. And then there's the same NIMBY problems I outlined earlier. Many people who live near tiny home communities worry about them turning into shantytown slums or otherwise blighted neighborhoods that reduce property values.
Right. It's a depressing feature of communities where the cost of living is sky high, for instance, the Bay Area, that if you own a home there that is worth upwards of $2 million, You might be politically progressive otherwise, but you're going to be most likely dead set against any political reform that could lower the value of your home.
Yeah, sad to say, but absolutely true. I mean, that happens, that plays out on the streets of New York all the time, including right next to me, right in my neighborhood. Same kind of stuff. Some homeless advocates argue against tiny homes, calling them patronizing and exploitative, and expressing skepticism about their transitional status. They think the residents of such communities, tucked away behind that gas station or on empty plots of municipal land, are being treated like second-class citizens and not allowed to fully integrate with society. But many formerly homeless residents of tiny homes are thankful for the locking doors that provide the privacy and security they lacked in shelters or on the street. One such resident described tiny homes generally as, quote, utter relief, like reaching the shore after a shipwreck. To the people out there on streets living in cardboard boxes in alleyways, this represents the promised land, end quote.
Yeah, and for the people who are saying that they're second-class citizens, I would encourage them not to make perfect the enemy of the good. If something is a better condition than what preceded it, the fact that it's not the best conceivable situation doesn't mean it's not good enough. If the tiny home is a better condition than what preceded it, then that is an improvement on the situation and a step in the right direction.
Yes, I'm inclined to agree with you on that. I mean, I do think that homeless people deserve dignity and respect and shouldn't be shuttled away into the corners of our society. And if these tiny home communities are behind the gas station, we risk running into that situation. But on the whole, I agree with you. A little bit is better than nothing. Perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good.
And what would we say to someone on the street? Like, yes, we could provide you with a home, but we don't think it befits your dignity. So please stay on the street until we found a better solution.
Yeah.
That just doesn't seem acceptable to me.
Right. I can't argue with that. Homelessness has been one of our country's most intractable problems for decades, and I think there are two primary reasons for that. One is that it's a multifaceted problem without a single solution. Remember how I explained in our episode about curing cancer that cancer is not one thing, and that's why it's so hard to cure?
Yes, I do.
Well, homelessness is also not one thing. It's a spectrum of conditions that touches on many, if not most, of the toughest issues bedeviling American society. Poverty, violence, drug abuse, health care, the declining fortunes of the middle and working classes, just to name a handful. A problem like homelessness neither appears nor disappears overnight. It took decades for it to become so chronic. And even under ideal conditions, it will take decades to eradicate. Put another way, I think it would be exceedingly hard to end homelessness even if we were determined to do so. And that's the second reason for the intractability of homelessness. We're not determined to do what's necessary to get rid of it. And by we, I mean every one of us. We've all become inured to homelessness. You walk by the tent city in Seattle, while I pass numerous unsheltered homeless people on my travels through New York City. We do nothing about it. And we're the liberals, the so-called bleeding heart do-gooders. If a critical mass of Americans truly thought of housing as a fundamental right, we would simply not tolerate the conditions that make it impossible for 580,000 of our fellow Americans to have a place of their own. Apparently, owning a gun is a fundamental right in America, but having a safe place to sleep at night isn't.
Yeah, that's an uncomfortable point. It's not a defense, it's more an observation that what becomes normal ceases to become like a motivation for change. I go back to the number of people who die in car accidents in this country every single year. It's something like 375,000. And if that were a new thing, if next year for the very first time 300,000 people died on the roads, we would think, oh my God, this is appalling. We must stop this immediately. But because it's normal, you just shrug and figure, yeah, that's the thing that happens. And I feel like it's become that way with homelessness.
Yes.
Like when I grew up, I never saw a homeless person in my hometown. Now I see homeless people every day. And because it's every day, I don't really notice it in a way that makes me think I need to do something about that.
Yeah, I remember learning in high school psychology class about this concept called sensory adaptation. You know, like if there's an annoying noise in the background, at first it's bothering you, but if you listen to it long enough, you become used to it and it becomes part of the background hum, you know? And I feel like that's what's going on with homelessness. It's part of the background noise in our society. We all tolerate it, and it's really an intolerable situation to the people involved, and it should be intolerable to our consciences as well, but somehow it isn't.
Yeah. And partly it's because when you end up on the street, you, in many cases, lose your voice in society. No one listens to you anymore.
Yep.
You might not be able to vote because
Yep.
you don't have an address to which the ballot would be sent. You become invisible in many ways.
Yeah. So instead of thinking of housing as a fundamental right, a sizable minority thinks America consists of makers and takers, with the takers ultimately unwilling to do what's necessary to lift themselves out of their adverse circumstances, and therefore unworthy of public investment or private intervention. That same sizable minority employs certain calcified aspects of our political system, the Electoral College, the U.S. Senate, the Supreme Court, to carry out their program of neglect that is anything but benign, and we all suffer as a result.
Yeah.
As I've already mentioned, there are solutions to homelessness, just as there are solutions to climate change or the COVID pandemic or gun violence, just to name a few other seemingly intractable problems that you and I have addressed in prior episodes of this podcast. The issue is not that we don't have the tools or the knowledge to solve them. It's that we don't have the will.
I think you are probably right. Homelessness is largely an urban problem. And so that brings us back to that urban-rural divide that we've talked about on some previous episodes. Of course, our red state neighbors depend on farm subsidies to keep their farms in operation. There's an element of my need to be helped out is more morally defensible than your need to be helped out. The things that I need, the things that I take, are better than the things that you need and the things that you would like to take.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of depressing.
Yeah, and it seems so far away to me now, but seems so obvious at the same time that we need a national politics that dignifies everybody's legitimate concerns. You know, the rural person who's suffering from opioid epidemic in the community and the lack of broadband. Those are important needs. And just because they're Trump voters doesn't mean they shouldn't have their needs honored and have us confer on those needs the respect that they deserve. And similarly, the urban issues around homelessness. You know, we need a politics that is both and not either or. And it just seems so far away from us right now.
Yeah.
You know, kind of heartbreaking.
Well, we have two parties, I think, that see politics as a zero-sum game, that your win is my loss. And
yeah,
we desperately need a country in which we have a vision for something that we can all experience as a win, where I don't win by taking away from you and you don't win by taking away from me. Agreed.
All right, well, I have a question for you for next time. Are you ready for this?
Yes, and I hope it's not going to leave me in as dark a place as this episode has left me. So lay it on me.
I'm not sure. We'll see. Looking back over 40-plus episodes of Mansplaining, as I often do because I'm very proud of our podcast, Mark, I noticed that we haven't covered the COVID-19 pandemic. We covered the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919. We covered whether viruses are alive, And COVID has come up tangentially in many other episodes, including today's. But we haven't addressed it directly yet. And that seems strange to me since it's arguably been the number one most important topic in the world for the entire time that you and I have been doing this podcast.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about COVID, Mark, but not in our typical Q&A format. So hear me out. I'm not going to name names, but I have a close family member who is a dyed-in-the-wool anti-vaxxer. Despite abundant evidence of the vaccine's efficacy, despite all the anger, insults, and public shaming directed their way, despite numerous attempts by me to convince them otherwise, this family member is never, ever going to take a COVID vaccine. And I'm simultaneously outraged, appalled, but also fascinated by this point of view. And I desperately want to understand it. So here's my question for you, Mark, and it's kind of more of an assignment than a question. I want you to research the anti-COVID vax movement, and then, in all seriousness and good faith, give me the very best arguments for why somebody should not get vaccinated against COVID. What do you think?
I think it's as if you dropped $1 into a sewer and told me, Mark, could you just jump in there and get me that $1 back? But I will do it. I will do that thing. And hopefully I will come back untainted. So we are done with this episode. If you have any thoughts on this episode, or would you like to leave a comment or a question, you can find our Facebook page. It's called Mansplaining the Podcast. We do appreciate when people like the page and give likes to our posts. You can find our sources there. Joe will be posting his sources to that page. And you can follow up and do your own research. If you would like other people to learn about this podcast, and you feel like you've done the best work you can do by shouting about it and on the subway on your way to work in the morning, probably your best second measure is to leave a review and a star rating on your favorite podcast provider. That could be Spotify, if you're not too concerned about that Joe Rogan thing. It could be iTunes. Wherever you get your podcasts, if you leave us a rating, you do us a solid, and you help other people discover Mansplaining.
Amen.
That's it for this episode. That was Joe. I'm Mark, and we hope to see you again soon.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.